I learned that song like 2 days before I performed it live. Oh my gosh, and I about puked every time I performed on the show. It was just...
On May 30th, 2017, a 12-year-old girl from Oklahoma walked onto the America's Got Talent stage carrying a pink puppet named Petunia and barely enough composure to speak to the judges before the music started. She had told them she was plagued with stage fright, and standing there under the studio lights, facing a panel and an audience of thousands, that seemed entirely credible. What happened when she started singing through her puppet was one of those moments that defines a season and, in this case, an entire era of the competition. She had chosen Summertime from Porgy and Bess, a song that demands genuine vocal control and emotional poise, and she delivered it with both. The audience gasped. Mel B stood up and pressed the golden buzzer without waiting for anyone else's reaction. Within 30 hours, the audition had become the most viewed video in AGT history. Within weeks, a middle schooler from a small town had become a global phenomenon. What followed was more complicated than any of the people celebrating her that night could have predicted. The rest of her run on the show matched the audition in energy, if not in pure shock value. She introduced additional puppet characters, Oscar the Shy Mouse and Edna Dornacher, a feisty older woman with a well-publicized interest in Simon Cowell, and proved that her skill set was considerably broader than a single stunning debut. By the finale, audiences had been watching her for months and had grown genuinely attached. When the votes came in on September 20th, 2017, Darci Lynne won Season 12 of America's Got Talent, not just by a margin but with the highest vote total in the show's finale history at that point. She was 12 years old. The confetti fell, the judges applauded, and the world told her that her life was about to become something extraordinary. What they didn't fully explain was what extraordinary would actually cost. The attention that descended on her after the win was immediate and overwhelming. Social media followings multiplied within days. Interview requests, photo shoots, and appearance invitations arrived in a volume that would have been difficult for an adult entertainment professional to manage. She was booked on The Ellen DeGeneres Show, performed alongside established entertainers like Terry Fator and Pentatonix, and watched a planned 5-city tour expand into a 52-venue nationwide run. Her first major solo show sold out in 6 minutes. These were remarkable achievements by any standard. They were also happening to someone who still had algebra homework and a locker combination. She returned to Deer Creek Middle School hoping to find some version of her previous life still waiting for her. What she found instead was a student body that had reorganized itself partially around her presence. She described the experience in interviews as a little crazy, explaining that new students she barely knew would react to seeing her in the hallway as though she were someone they had been following for years. That constant recognition, maintained across every school day, carried its own particular weight. Her brother Nate found himself navigating a related but distinct version of the same problem. Being a teenager trying to develop his own identity, while every conversation around him eventually circled back to questions about his sister. The fame Darci had earned was touching people who had never chosen it. The management compromise the family reached was to schedule touring around weekends and school holidays, preserving the weekday structure as much as possible. It was a practical solution that acknowledged the problem without fully resolving it. A schedule built around travel, sound checks, performances, and meet and greets on the days that were supposed to be rest still left very little room for a person to simply exist without obligation. The boundary between who Darci was privately and who Darci Lynne was publicly began to blur in ways that were difficult to name at the time and only became clearer in retrospect. The truth about what she had been experiencing underneath the public-facing confidence came out gradually across interviews given years later. She had entered the competition as a genuinely shy child whose parents had encouraged her into pageantry specifically because they hoped it would help her open up socially. The International Cinderella Scholarship Program she had participated in before AGT had been their way of helping her build the confidence to perform, not a sign that she was already comfortable being seen. Winning America's Got Talent didn't transform that underlying temperament. It just placed someone with a deeply reserved nature into circumstances that required her to be publicly visible and emotionally available on an almost constant basis. The impostor syndrome that set in after the win was specific and persistent. She would wonder privately whether the whole thing had been luck, whether she was actually as capable as the audience seemed to believe, whether the next performance would expose some gap between expectation and reality that all the previous performances had somehow concealed. That internal questioning didn't diminish with each successful show. It continued running beneath the surface, challenging her sense of her own worth at moments when the external evidence of that worth was literally filling arenas. She has described it as always having to be the happy, perfect girl that everyone fell in love with on AGT, a pressure that was invisible to the audience but constant for the person inside it. The transition to homeschooling came after she tried for as long as she could to maintain the structure of public school alongside the demands of touring. She eventually described that period as genuinely rough, explaining how difficult it had been to miss substantial stretches of class time and then return to catch up on accumulated work while preparing for the next round of performances. The decision to shift to homeschooling was not made easily, but it gave her the flexibility that the conventional school schedule couldn't accommodate, both professionally and in terms of her mental health. The physical toll that accumulated alongside the psychological weight was significant. Chronic fatigue became a regular presence in her life rather than an occasional consequence of a particularly demanding week. Headaches arrived with frequency. Her voice, the instrument around which her entire career had been built, felt strained and overworked from the pace of constant performing. There were mornings when getting out of bed required more effort than she had available. Sleep didn't consistently repair the exhaustion that performing depleted. And the panic attacks that came with increasing regularity didn't respect the schedule of performances or the expectations of audiences who had bought tickets months in advance. The sensation of breathing difficulty and chest tightness arriving in the moments before walking on stage created a particular kind of fear that was different from ordinary pre-performance nerves. She was caught between what her body and mind needed and what her career was requiring of her. Her parents responded to what they were observing by pulling back the public exposure, declining interview requests that had previously been accepted as routine, limiting social media activity, and creating a physical and emotional buffer between Darci and the constant demands of her career. They brought in therapists, counselors, and doctors to provide professional support for what she was going through. The choices they made during that period reflected an understanding that the most important thing they could protect was not her career trajectory but her fundamental well-being. That reorientation of priorities required saying no to opportunities that would have been straightforwardly beneficial to her public profile, and they made those choices without apparent hesitation. The period of retreat and recovery that followed gave Darci something she hadn't had in years: time that wasn't already spoken for. The pandemic created an additional and involuntary version of that stillness, and she has described finding herself at home with no particular agenda for the first time in a long while, initially uncertain what to do with that space. What she eventually did with it was teach herself to write music. There were no announcements about this creative development, no press coverage of the process. It was simply a young woman alone in a room discovering something new about what she was capable of creating. That private exploration led to collaboration with Oklahoma musicians Maggie McClure and Shane Henry, and ultimately to her debut single Push Our Luck, released on February 5, 2024. The song reflected the kind of nervous, hopeful energy associated with early romantic feelings, and it was the product of genuine personal experience rather than industry guidance about what her audience was expecting. The music video she produced for the song won Best Music Video 2024 from the Los Angeles Film Awards, a recognition that positioned her not just as a performer but as a creative voice with a perspective on how her own work should be presented visually. In 2022, she had also appeared in the Netflix film A Cowgirl Song, a role that drew naturally from her Oklahoma background and allowed her to explore acting as a separate avenue from the ventriloquism and singing that had defined her public identity. A subsequent single called Someone Wake Me Up showed a vocal register that was noticeably different from what audiences had heard from her at 12, deeper and more emotionally complex in a way that reflected the years of experience behind it. Her return to the AGT stage in 2024 for America's Got Talent Fantasy League became a deliberate statement about who she had become in the years since the original win. She performed I've Got the Music in Me, and at one point in the performance she set Petunia down and picked up a guitar instead. Before taking the stage, she had acknowledged to reporters that she felt pressure to live up to her original appearance and that she didn't want to be placed in a box. The performance was her answer to both of those things simultaneously, honoring the history while refusing to be limited by it. Beyond the creative reinvention, She has directed some of her energy toward causes that connect directly with what her own experience taught her about the hidden costs of public life. A visit to Seacrest Studios inside the Children's Hospital of Orange County, where she performed for children managing serious illness, reflected a specific understanding of what a moment of genuine connection and lightness can mean to someone in a difficult situation. Her involvement with Horses for Mental Health, an organization that uses equine therapy for people struggling with mental wellness, came alongside public statements that conveyed personal conviction rather than celebrity endorsement. Standing with actor Dennis Quaid and others in that campaign, she spoke about being grateful to be part of highlighting how horses can support mental well-being, and the language she used made clear that the cause resonated with her own experience rather than simply fitting her public image. The arc of Darci Lynne's story, from a shy 12-year-old who could barely speak to the judges before performing, to a global phenomenon at 12, to a teenager quietly managing the costs of that fame, to a young adult reshaping her creative identity on her own terms, contains something that resonates well beyond the specific details of ventriloquism and talent competitions. It is a story about what happens to a person when the world decides it knows who you are before you have finished figuring that out yourself, and about the particular kind of courage it takes to grow into someone different from the version people originally fell in love with. She is currently developing a new touring show for 2025 that draws on the full range of what she has become. Singer, songwriter, storyteller, performer, and yes, ventriloquist, but integrated on her own terms rather than as the defining category that everything else is organized around. That distinction matters more than it might appear to. When someone's public identity becomes fixed at a particular moment of achievement, the expectation is that they will continue to deliver variations of that same achievement indefinitely. Breaking free from that expectation without losing the audience that created it requires both creative confidence and a clear sense of who you are that isn't contingent on who other people need you to be. Darci Lynne appears to have found that. The girl who stood trembling on the AGT stage at 12 and transformed into someone else the moment the music started has grown into a young woman who no longer needs the transformation to feel real in front of an audience. The puppet is still part of the act, but it is no longer the whole of it. The voice is still extraordinary, but it is being used for songs she wrote herself about experiences she actually had rather than technical demonstrations of what she was capable of at a given age. The platform is still significant, but it is being directed toward things that matter to her personally rather than simply toward maintaining visibility. That combination, talent, authenticity, and a genuine sense of purpose, is considerably rarer and more durable than any single viral audition, no matter how many 100 million times it gets watched.